Well, this next question is one that's been asked of R.C. many times over the years. How is the Protestant notion of sola fide, faith alone, consistent with James 2:24, which says, "You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone"?
Again, in the 16th century, when this debate had reached its apex, and the Council of Trent in the middle of the 15th century was the ecumenical council called by the Roman Catholic Church to respond to the Reformation. And in that response, particularly in the Sixth Session of Trent, the Roman Catholic Church defined de fide, her doctrine of justification by faith, and set forth canons that anathematized distortions of their view of justification, including the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone. So to this day, that doctrine of sola fide still remains under the anathema of Rome as recently as the Catholic Catechism. But in that response at the Sixth Session of Trent, you saw frequent references and allusions to 220 and 224 and so on there in James. And so this has been a long-time discussion. In Romans, Paul makes it clear that by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. And he teaches us that justification is by faith alone. James seems to deny that it's by faith alone, but rather it's by faith and works. And the thing that makes it difficult, John, is that in both Paul's letter and in James' letter, the same word for justification is used in the Greek. And the plot gets thicker because in Romans, when Paul wants to prove his point, his exhibit A is Abraham. When James wants to prove his point, his exhibit A is Abraham. The problem is that when Paul appeals to Abraham to prove his point, he appeals to Abraham in Genesis 15, where Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. And Paul labors the point in Romans 4 that Abraham was justified before he did any good works. Okay. Now, when James talks about justification, he says, was not Abraham justified by works when he offered up Isaac on the altar so that his faith then was fulfilled? Okay. Now, the question is, are the two biblical writers addressing the same question? And to understand the difference between Paul and James, I want to go to James and ask this. What question was James trying to answer? And it makes it clear. James says, if a man says he has faith, but has no works, will that faith justify him? Because faith without works is dead. And so what James is answering, the question is what kind of faith is the faith that one must have in order really to be justified? And his answer really doesn't differ that significantly from Paul, because when Paul follows justification in chapter 5 and then in chapter 6, he's trying to show that the fruit of your justification, the witness of your justification, the manifestation of true faith is obedience. And so James is showing here that Abraham demonstrated his faith in Genesis 22 when he offered up Isaac on the altar. Let me just be a little bit technical here. The difference is this. Paul is asking the question, how is a person justified before God in the ultimate sense? James is asking the question, how is a person's claim to have faith justified? Now, justified before whom? Obviously, before men, because we can't see the heart. God didn't have to wait till Genesis 22 to know that Abraham's faith that he manifested in Genesis 15 was real saving faith. But we don't know it until we see the outworking of that faith in his sacrifice of his son Isaac. In my book, Faith Alone, I go into a lot more detail about this debate, but I can't spend the whole time here on it, but that's basically the approach.